Hi, I'm Len Rydell, the Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society, and welcome to another lecture in the Vicksburg campaign series that we executed in February of 1995. This particular lecture is going to focus on one of the interesting elements of the campaign, and it is illustrative. It is not exclusive, but because of the nature of the speaker, whom I have great admiration for, and his ability to tell a good story, this particular encounter, the Third Louisiana Redan, is a story that is just too rich and robust to not tell in this sort of a setting. And so while I made no effort to try to present all the military activities of the campaign in this study, I let the field work do that. I was quite excited to bring the former editor of Virginia's Civil War, which was a precursor of the magazine Civil War Quarterly, which was edited by Kent Masterson Brown and was founded by Chris Curran and his wife Lisa back in the late 80s. I had met Kent in the late 80s when he was working for the Civil War Society, and indeed it was the seminars, the Second Manassas, the Periville, the Antietam programs that I attended, in which I just found myself held in rapt attention at the sorts of lectures that you're listening to now and are going to hear elsewhere in this series, that fascinated me so much that I decided I wanted to build an organization like the Blue and Gray Education Society. Kent was a graduate of the Washington Lee Law School and had great admiration for the VMI cadets, of which I was a cadet and a graduate in the 70s when Kent was in law school next door at W&L. And so we immediately found a bonding that made us good friends. And so early on in this, I went looking for friends that I could bring into this. And in talking to Kent, he told me the story of Colonel Irwin from Missouri, who was Henry Clay's grandson. And I found the story so captivating and interesting in the manner in which Kent told it that I decided I wanted to do two things. As you will determine and see from this presentation, Kent has Southern that rolls off his tongue. I mean, the honey and everything else, he has a Southern drawl just like nobody's business. Being a Lexington, Kentucky lawyer, you can listen to him talk for hours and hours. And so I just listing that in of itself gave me ideas for this program. And the first of those is this lecture, which depicts a heartwarming story. I won't even do anything other than tell you it's a heartwarming story of Valor at the Third Louisiana Redan. Please join me in welcoming Kent Masterson Brown.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I only wish that I could stay here through the afternoon. I've been called back home, and I have to get on a plane right after I finish this talk. But I've heard all about how wonderful this tour has been, and I know that your visit to the Vicksburg National Military Park will truly be the capstone, because it is a spectacular park. And I hope in this little talk I'm going to give here that I'll give you a little of a human side to a rather dramatic clash at Vicksburg. Really, the subject of this talk is not as much the struggle for the Third Louisiana Redan, although that is what the story somewhat swirls around. It's really the story of a colonel and his lady, Colonel Eugene Irwin and Josephine Irwin. Growing up in Lexington, Kentucky, literally along the lands once owned by Henry Clay, and knowing many of the descendants of the great pacificator, I, over the years, heard many stories about many interesting members of the family and have known them. No story, though, captivated my attention more than one I heard as a child, that somewhere among all these disparate members of the Clay family was a battle flag that had been returned to Lexington after the bearer of it, a Clay descendant, had fallen at Vicksburg. I used to think as a little boy, somewhere in this town, in somebody's attic, is a flag that was carried in the Those Clay descendants, though, who I suspected had this flag, if the story was true, were much older than me, and though my father purchased the house of first memory to me from his grandson, Henry Clay, I never felt that I could go to them and ask, because the ages were so different. Years passed, though, and one bright, beautiful spring day not too long ago, I was walking through the Lexington Cemetery. For those of you who ever visit Lexington, it's one of the most remarkable cemeteries in America. The great rural cemetery with some of the most remarkable people buried there, not the least of whom is John Cabell Breckinridge and John Hunt Morgan and all of his brothers, Basil Duke, General Roger Hanson, General Randall Lee Gibson, the direct descendant, of course, of Samuel Gibson, the founder of Port Gibson. And he rests there, as well as Major Henry B. McClellan, who was Jeb Stuart's chief of staff. These are just a small number of characters who lie buried in the Lexington Cemetery, along with, of course, the great compromiser himself, Henry Clay. And below this shaft over Henry Clay's grave is the grave site of the rest of the Clay members, family members, including that of John Morrison Clay, his youngest son, and his wife, Josephine. Behind the graves of John and Josephine Clay are also family members bearing the name Irwin. And near the John Clay Monument is a small granite stone erected to the memory of Colonel Eugene Irwin, 6th Regiment Missouri Volunteers, CSA, who it reads, fell in the defense of Vicksburg, Mississippi, June 25th, 1863. And you can imagine, as I was looking at this, I immediately asked myself, my God, do you think, possibly, that battle flag that we've heard so much about possibly was the 6th Missouri's? Well, it was not too long after that I get a telephone call from Louisiana Gibson Simpson. Now, she is the direct descendant of Tobias Gibson and Samuel Gibson, the founders of Port Gibson, Mississippi. Known as Louisiana, as every generation of Gibsons, a female is named Louisiana because they settled in Louisiana. And so Lou Simpson, who married Henry Clay Simpson, the great-grandson of Henry Clay, called me up and said, Kent, I'd like you to come over and look at some papers I have that relate to the Civil War, and maybe you can help me with them. Well, you can imagine what kind of a path I beat to this house. I mean, this is 35 years of thinking about what this family might have, and suddenly an invitation comes over the telephone. Well, when I arrived at Lou's house, literally located below where John Clay lived, along the Tates Creek Pike south of Lexington, there was a photograph on the table of Colonel Eugene Irwin, an ambulatory photograph, along with letters written to him by Henry Clay. There was a memory book of Josephine Clay with letters and clippings related to Colonel Irwin. And folks, in the back bedroom, unfolded on the bed, was a tattered, blood-stained, Van Doren patterned battle flag of the 6th Missouri Infantry. It is photographed on the cover of that little booklet that I've prepared for you. For 35 years, I had searched for that thing, and there it was, complete with the honors inscribed on it by Josephine herself, of the valor of the members of the 6th Missouri at Corinth, Mississippi, and of Colonel Eugene Irwin. Now, what was the relationship between these two? And this, of course, is the story that I'm going to tell you today. The story necessarily starts with Henry Clay himself, who was born in Hanover County, Virginia, in 1777 and moved to Lexington, Kentucky for studying law with George Wythe in Richmond, Virginia. Clay entered the practice of law in Lexington and embarked upon a political career that was, as we all know, ultimately frustrated 3 times at the very gates of the White House, illustrating his almost meteoric rise in fame and in notoriety and in wealth in Lexington, Kentucky. Is a 1,500 estate which he acquired and which he named Ashland. And the home reconstructed by James Clay, his son, still stands on the site of Henry Clay's original federal home. No sooner had Henry Clay arrived in Lexington, Kentucky, than he met and married Lucretia Hart, the daughter of one of the founding pioneers of Kentucky. Interestingly, her ancestors were the Hart brothers, who, along with Colonel Richard Henderson, founded the Transylvania Company, which employed Daniel Boone to hack out the Wilderness Road. So you can imagine how old the Hart family is in Kentucky's history. To the marriage of Henry and Lucretia Clay were born 11 children, 3 of whom would die very young. Young Henry Clay Jr. would be killed at the Battle of Buena Vista in the Mexican War in February of 1847. The remaining children, Theodore Wythe, Thomas Hart, Susan Hart, Anne Brown, James Brown, and John Morrison, would live until adulthood. Anne Brown Clay, named, by the way, for his law partner. There are no Browns in the Clay family. Anne Brown Clay seems to have been a favorite child in the first statement. He was Henry and Lucretia's she was their 5th child. Born at Ashland, she apparently was not well as a youngster. Her health never really improved as she grew older. She was nevertheless pretty, and being the daughter of so prominent a man as Henry Clay, Anne was a noticeable choice for any of the gentlemen of the town. One such man came along. The 27-year-old James Irwin moved to Lexington from Tennessee. Born in Asheville, North Carolina in 1796, Irwin had grown up in Bedford County, Tennessee. There he studied law and come to the Athens of the West, which Lexington was known, for much the same reason as Henry Clay 3 decades before. The law, however, was not James' real interest. Rather, he dabbled in land speculation. Altogether, he seemed to be a rather bright and energetic young man, and Henry Clay seemed to approve of this marriage. James Irwin married Anne Brown Clay on October 21, 1823, and with the help of Henry Clay, the Irwins purchased a wonderful federal home known as the Woodlands, not too far from Ashland. They were almost neighboring farms. In all, it appears as though the Irwins were financially successful. James traveled to New Orleans often. During the winter, he took the entire family down there to stay. There, he set about business of speculating in government lands, and upon his death, he left an immensely complicated estate, made up largely of lands in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas. To the marriage of James Irwin and Anne Clay Irwin were born 7 children: Julia, Henry Clay, James Jr., Lucretia Hart, Andrew Eugene, Mary, and Charles Edward. 2 of the Irwin children were in infancy. Most of them did not live very long. Anne Clay Irwin died on December 20, 1835. It's likely she died of tuberculosis, and if you'll recall, Henry Clay himself suffered from tuberculosis and died from it, and I probably think most all members of the family acquired one way or another, and it either led to their death or, as tuberculosis goes, it can be a creeping sort of thing. It can kill almost instantly, but some people live for many years with it. It seems Anne lived long enough and finally died of tuberculosis, as did many of her children. It's also, it could be as well that the early ventures of James Irwin to New Orleans were really for Anne and those children to take the cure, to go to some warm climate. Interestingly, in the Cushing book, it's noted that Alonzo Cushing's father was tuberculous. And before his father died, he journeyed, interestingly, to Vicksburg, Mississippi, where his sister's family were living. He was the probate judge in the old courthouse there. And it was there that Alonzo Cushing's father tried to take the cure, only to have to go back to Ohio and die within the year. So it was not uncommon for folks to take the cure in southern climes with consumption or tuberculosis. When Anne died, James Irwin, not wishing to stay in Lexington to really raise the family, kind of became a ne'er-do-well, all things considered, arranged to have all his children, except the two oldest sons, Henry and James, given over to Lucretia Hart Clay, Henry Clay's wife, for their future care and support. He turned them over to the Clays. He moved to New Orleans. Only occasionally thereafter did he ever venture back to Lexington to visit those children. James Irwin, it appears, had not turned out to be the shining light all had hoped. A speculator, a gambler, he, for some time, it was learned after his death, had been purchasing his lands in the name of other people so as to avoid having to deal with his wife's community interest in the property. Title to those properties naturally were thrown into dispute after his death. As you will see, poor Eugene Irwin spent much of his life trying to track down what family properties were owned. James did marry again in 1843, then to Margaret Julia Johnson, cousin to none other than Colonel and Vice President and presidential candidate Richard Mentor Johnson, the fabled Kentuckian who, it was rumored, killed Chief Tecumseh at the Battle of the Thames in 1813. Two children were born to that second marriage. One son of James and Anne Irwin seemed to stand out. Andrew Eugene, born in October 1830, quickly became a favorite in the household of the illustrious grandfather Henry Clay. Young Eugene was born in the Woodlands, and after the death of his mother, he was raised by Henry and Lucretia Clay at Ashland. The great statesman took special interest in young Eugene. He found the lad to be both attractive and loving. It's known Henry Clay took young Eugene with him to Washington, D.C. On several occasions. There the boy met many of the notable men of the day. It seems Eugene's desire as he grew older was to enter the United States Military Academy. Something, however, prevented him from doing so, and it may have been poor health, and I'd rather think that it was poor health. Another grandson of Henry Clay, Henry Clay III, did attend West Point. It may have been that Clay's cloud over the War Department could not be extended to two grandsons of the Corps of Cadets at the same time. In a letter to Henry Clay III, the son of the lamented hero of the Battle of Buena Vista, who was then attending the academy but not doing particularly well in his studies, Henry Clay wrote the following. Quote, "I'm afraid, my dear child, that you do not sufficiently appreciate the great advantage you have in your position at the academy, nor the disgrace that you would have attached to your name if you should be compelled to leave it from neglect or incompetency. How poor Eugene Irwin would rejoice if he had your situation." Unable to attend West Point, Eugene resolved to enter the mercantile business. In late 1850, Henry Clay took him to Washington. There he set about helping the young lad find placement in a New York or Boston merchandising firm. According to his grandfather, Eugene desired a position in a large commission house or wholesale grocery, quote, "but if a suitable place cannot be obtained in one of them, he'd go into a dry goods store," end quote. Henry Clay wrote to a prospective employer of his grandson's resolve, and he said this, "Although his parents have been wealthy, that is not their present condition, and he is convinced that his success and prosperity in life depend upon his own exertions. He is therefore resolved to work diligently and laboriously to advance his fortunes," end quote. It seems Eugene first entered into business in what was then referred to as a collecting house in New York, where his job entailed him to perform such menial tasks as sweeping the floors every morning before sunup. His grandfather was not particularly happy with the lad's situation, and by March 1851, Eugene's fortunes, though, changed. He was hired by the Pacific Mail Steamship Company, a shipping company founded in 1848 by William Henry and Lloyd Aspinwall. The steam navigation firm offered to send the young man to Monterey, California, where he would work in their Pacific Coast offices. Raised by Henry Clay and Lucretia Hart Clay, Eugene truly had become more of a son to the great statesman and his wife than a grandson. Eugene, their land speculation and gambling were well known. They had shown little interest in their own family and had dissipated most of what they had acquired. Unbeknownst to young Eugene, his father had suffered an incapacitating stroke while in New Orleans in 1851. He died there in June of that year. His estate was in shambles. Creditors from his speculations and gambling hounded the family for money. Henry Clay took it upon himself to look after the interests of Eugene in the disputed estate, and discovering that James Irwin had acquired much land, he sought to acquire for his grandchildren his late daughter's community interest in the properties. While in Monterey, California, young Andrew Eugene Irwin met a beautiful, dark-haired young girl by the name of Josephine Deborah Russell. Josephine had been born in Fulton, Missouri on December 7, 1835. She was the daughter of Colonel William Henry Russell and his wife, Zanette Freeland Russell. Colonel Russell was a Kentuckian. In fact, he had been born and raised in Lexington, Kentucky, and had served as a member of the Kentucky House of Representatives. He had been instrumental in securing Henry Clay's election to the United States Senate in 1831. Colonel Russell's father was a noted Revolutionary War hero and Indian fighter. In Lexington, the Russell Cave Pike was named for Colonel Russell's father, General Robert Spotswood Russell. And across the state one finds names of towns like Russellville and Russell Springs, both named for the old general. William Russell and his family emigrated to Missouri in 1831. There he served in the Black Hawk War and was elected to the Missouri legislature from Callaway County. In 1844, Russell was appointed to the United States Marshal of Missouri, a territory then comprising what became the states of Iowa, Missouri, Minnesota, Kansas, and Nebraska. But by 1846, Russell, leading a large delegation, took his family to California. And upon his arrival at the Pacific Coast, he was made Secretary of State of California by acting Governor John C. Fremont. And in 1851, he was appointed Collector of Customs in Monterey, California. The meeting of Andrew Eugene Irwin and Josephine Deborah Russell most likely was not by chance. Rather, it was arranged. Henry Clay, always looking after his dear grandson, and notified his close friend and political ally, Colonel Russell, of Eugene's presence in Monterey. Russell responded, and Andrew Eugene became a familiar guest in the Russell home. Upon meeting Josephine, alas, only 5 years his junior, Eugene became attracted to her immediately. One visit followed another, and soon the two were in love and talking of marriage. The two young people, so far away from Kentucky, in common, seemed to have planned their future. With Colonel Russell such a staunch supporter of the great compromiser, one can only imagine his encouragement of his daughter's interest in the young man who was Henry Clay's grandson. The great compromiser, Henry Clay, died on June 29, 1852. The whole nation went into mourning. Clay had been one of the great men of his age. He had dearly loved Eugene. Although Lucretia Hart Clay still lived, Andrew Eugene Irwin was finally on his own. Andrew Eugene Irwin and Josephine Deborah Russell returned to Callaway County, Missouri, and there they were married on July 10, 1853. With no money from his father's or mother's estate, Eugene had virtually nothing to offer his new bride, but a supreme willingness to succeed. In Missouri, Eugene saw the vast movement of settlers, Independence, Kansas City, and the great western trails beyond. And wanting to become a merchant, Andrew Eugene decided to move to Independence, and there he could start a business which could supply goods and supplies to settlers heading across the Great Plains to the Rocky Mountains. Thus, Andrew Eugene Irwin and Josephine Russell Irwin settled in Independence, Missouri. While in Independence, 3 children would be born to Andrew and Josephine. Lucretia Clay, born in 1854, known as Lula, Nettie Russell, born in 1857, and Mary Webster, born in 1861. Eugene, now on his own, spent much of his time in the mercantile establishment in Independence and on the road in Louisiana and Mississippi, trying to secure his interest in the property of his father's estate. His efforts at securing his property only came to an end with the storm clouds of war. Even after the bombardment of Fort Sumter, the Supreme Court of Louisiana was still considering a civil action filed by Eugene to determine the title of most of the properties his father had acquired in the state of Louisiana. With the outbreak of war, Andrew Eugene Irwin passed his lot with the Confederacy. It was not an easy choice for him. Josephine's father, Colonel Russell, had become a Republican and a supporter of Abraham Lincoln. He was rewarded by President Lincoln after the election of 1860 by being named United States Consul to Trinidad and Cuba, a post he would hold until 1865. To add to Eugene Irwin's problems, Missouri was bitterly divided. Any decision brought hardship and incurred the wrath of many of his neighbors, much like it did in Kentucky. Nevertheless, Eugene entered the Missouri militia in August 1861. By March 2nd, he was commissioned a first lieutenant in Rosser's battalion of Confederate Missouri Infantry. Because of his great popularity and personal magnetism, his rise in rank became meteoric. He served at the battles of Wilson Creek and Elkhorn Tavern, and continued to rise in popularity among his men. On May 15, 1862, Irwin was elected lieutenant colonel of a battalion designated as the 6th Regiment of Missouri Infantry. After taking part in the defense of Corinth, Mississippi in the spring of 1862, Irwin was promoted to the rank of colonel, commanding the 6th Missouri at Guntown, Mississippi on August 26, 1862. The regiment had been assigned to General Martin E. Greene's brigade and General Louis Hebert's division, General Earl Van Doren's Confederate Army. Irwin's first engagement as a regimental commander was near Iuka, Mississippi on September 19, 1862. He soon became known throughout his command as Old Pat for the way in which he looked after the welfare of his command. Corinth, Mississippi had been taken by federal forces, 4 divisions in all under General William Rosecrans. There, the Memphis and Charleston Railroad and the Mobile and Ohio Railroad crossed, a key strategic locality. The federal garrison constructed heavy breastworks and gun emplacements protecting the approaches to the important railroad crossing. North of the Memphis and Charleston Railroad, General Rosecrans constructed Battery Robinette along with flanking earthworks. On an eminence on the east side of the Mobile and Ohio Railroad was constructed Battery Powell and its earthworks. South of the Memphis and Charleston Railroad were built Battery Williams and Battery Phillips. In conjunction with the 2 infantry divisions of the cavalry brigade of General Sterling Price, General Earl Van Doren proposed an assault upon the federal positions protecting the strategically important town of Corinth, Mississippi in the fall of 1862. Price agreed and the 2 Confederate armies were united. The assaults were planned for October 3rd. According to Van Doren's plan, Greene's brigade in conjunction with 7 other brigades would strike north of the Memphis and Charleston Railroad, while 3 brigades would strike the emplacements south of the railroad. The assaults against the federal works north of Corinth on October 3rd stepped off at about mid-morning. Near the railroad, the 2nd Texas, Colonel William Rogers, 35th Mississippi, and a portion of the 6th and 9th Texas, along with a company of the 42nd Alabama, moved directly upon Battery Robinette. The 6th Missouri assaulted the works north of Battery Robinette directly into the town of Corinth, Mississippi, in conjunction with Greene's full brigade of Missourians and Mississippians. General Charles W. Pfeiffer's brigade of Texans and Arkansas soldiers and Colonel J.T. Gates' brigade of Missourians and Arkansas troops assaulted alongside. Colonel Irwin's men remembered their commander well that day. As the regiment lined up preparatory to the assault, Irwin atop his mount in the center of the unit. He knew the assault would be bloody, that his little command would suffer terribly. A courier rode up to the nearly idolized colonel and handed him an order. Suddenly, Irwin turned his mount around and faced his men. "Attention, battalion," he yelled. "Forward, double-quick, march." Over the ridge, the brave battalion marched, following their stately young commander. The federal artillery opened fire, and soon the whole landscape erupted in flames, smoke, and bursting shells, and the roar and roll of gunfire. The men moved out into an open field, into a swale, and then ascended a long slope toward the well-positioned enemy. The 6th Missouri neared point-blank range of the enemy guns. They were ripped apart by artillery fire. Irwin stopped his men and in the face of withering small arms fire ordered them to return a volley. After a ferocious fusillade, the command continued up the slope until it could go no farther. Hurled back upon its reserve regiments, the 6th Missouri in the shot-swept field dressed ranks again. Forward the Missourians marched, again behind their brave commander. The combat, wrote one veteran of Irwin's regiment, now became simply terrific. The two lines were not more than 20 paces apart and stand as resolute and firm as granite walls, he said. Colonel Irwin was wounded close to the Federal embrasures. He fell from his horse and was borne to the rear by his devoted men. Lieutenant Colonel Ian Hudspeth was then wounded and carried to the rear. Major A.B. Vaughn was killed. Captain F.M. Kinney of Company A was shot through the head. In a moment, not a field officer was left to command the old 6th Regiment. Even though it had no commander, the men of the 6th Missouri stood firm in front of the enemy works, but the regiment rapidly melted away. Ammunition was quickly exhausted, and the remaining men scrambled among the dead and wounded, removing cartridges from cartridge boxes of the fallen. Muskets became fouled by rapid firing. They were replaced by those scattered among the dead and wounded. Corporal William Huff, carrying the battle flag of the regiment, was hit 9 times before he handed the staff and flag, now rent with holes, to a comrade. Huff then crumpled to the ground. The left flank of the regiment was slowly being turned, but on the right, the men held their ground. Unyielding, recalled one soldier, Irwin's men fight on. They know old Pap is close by, that his eye is on them, that sometime he will send relief. Soon the main force of General C.W. Pfeiffer's 6th and 9th Texas Cavalry, all dismounted, moved forward to reinforce Irwin's thin ranks. Marching at the double quick with arms at right shoulder shift and keeping their alignment as if under review, they presented a sight both grand and imposing. How gladly, wrote one of the Missourians, swell the hearts of Irwin's little band, now reduced to a mere handful, as they catch a glimpse of those bayonets gleaming beneath the well-known battle flag of Texas. The Texans halted, leveled their muskets, all 700 of them, and with one loud report fired into the enemy works. They yelled, loaded, and fired again. Slowly, the little band of Missourians were withdrawn. Of the 300 who entered the fighting that day, only 30 answered roll call that morning, that evening. 31 of Irwin's men lay dead in front of the enemy works, 130 lay wounded, and 53 were missing, most of them presumed dead. Though the fighting was renewed the next day, Van Dorn's and Price's attacks had failed. Corinth was lost to the Confederacy. From the end of the fighting at Corinth, the war along the Mississippi River began to turn grim for the Confederate cause. General Ulysses S. Grant, from his base at Memphis, tried twice to penetrate Mississippi to take Vicksburg, the last great bastion on the Mississippi River, but failed between the fall of '62 and the spring of '63. Finally, with his Army of the Tennessee, along with a freshwater fleet of gunboats under the command of Admiral David D. Porter, Grant determined to move on Vicksburg from the Louisiana side of the river. He would cross at or below Port Gibson, march on Jackson, Mississippi, and then turn west toward Vicksburg. Although his lines of communication would be severed, Grant's enormous army and river squadrons, he believed, could outlast and hopefully overwhelm the Confederate defenders at Fortress Vicksburg. Van Dorn's little army, battered as it was, joined General John C. Pemberton's Army of Vicksburg in an effort to save the great fortress on the river. Elaborate trench lines, complete with redoubts and redans, were constructed along the high ground east of Vicksburg. In the event, Pemberton had to fall back to the very gates of the city. At the time, Colonel Irwin had become ill. What he suffered from is not known, probably tuberculosis. Typhoid, malaria, and a host of other deadly diseases spread through Pemberton's army, and Colonel Irwin may have been suffering from one of those maladies, no one knows. He notified Josephine by letter that he was ill and growing steadily worse. When Josephine learned of the fact that her husband was desperately ill, she determined to see him. Always the devoted wife, she could not remain in Independence, Missouri, leaving her 2 little daughters with their mammas. Josephine and her oldest daughter, Lula, age 9, headed east in a wagon to St. Louis. From St. Louis, they boarded a steamboat to Memphis, Tennessee. Securing a pass to proceed through the federal department of Memphis, Josephine and Lula in an open wagon rode all the way to a point east of Vicksburg, where they miraculously ran with the elements of General Pemberton's Army of Vicksburg. Once Grant's Army of the Tennessee began to move, it was relentless in meeting its objective. Moving down the Mississippi River, it crossed into Louisiana. Admiral Porter's Navy gunboats ran the Vicksburg batteries on April 16 and then on April 29 shelled the defenses south of Vicksburg at Grand Gulf. The leading elements of the massive invasion force led by General John A. McClernand's 13th Army Corps crossed on ferry boats at Bruinsburg just south of Grand Gulf and Fort Gibson on April 30. After crossing at Bruinsburg, it moved against Fort Gibson and Grand Gulf over land. On the morning of May 1, Colonel Irwin was ordered to leave his trenches at Grand Gulf and report to the front near Fort Gibson as rapidly as possible. Although ill, Irwin got his men on the road quickly. Covering 8 miles in 2.5 hours, Irwin's command reported to General Martin Greene, who in turn directed Irwin to bring his command into line along the right flank of the Confederate forces defending the town. In savage fighting, a desperately sick Eugene Irwin led the 6th Missouri ahead of the rest of the right flank command, driving the enemy before it until it recaptured a section of artillery that had been taken before Irwin's arrival on the field. In an advanced position, with no supports on either side, Irwin and his little regiment fought over 1.5 hours. In spite of Irwin's urgent appeals for help, no assistance came to him. Finally, his men's ammunition exhausted, Colonel Irwin reluctantly withdrew his tired and thin ranks, but not after the brave colonel suffered a severe wound in the foot. The 6th Missouri Infantry was the last regiment to leave the battlefield at Fort Gibson. Colonel Irwin withdrew the 6th Missouri to Bayou Pierre, and the 6th Missouri rejoined its brigade on May 2nd. Relieving Kentuckian General Lloyd Tillman's brigade, the Missourians again engaged the advancing enemy from Grindstone Ford to Hankinson's Ferry and checked the enemy before it drew east toward the Big Black River. Colonel Irwin, although sick and nursing a wound, stood with one of his lieutenants and 3 Parrott rifles guarding the ferry at Big Black River during the 3rd and 4th of May. The Missourians continued their withdrawal eastward toward Jackson and then back toward Vicksburg. Illness finally forced Irwin to give up his command. Too sick and suffering terribly from his wound, he delivered over the command of his Missourians to Major Stephen Cooper. Much of the retreat back toward Vicksburg was spent by Eugene in a jostling ambulance. At the Big Black River on May 17, the Missourians suffered terribly in the fearless assaults against the Federal left flank. They drove the enemy back, but only temporarily. The terrible losses only purchased time, and not much of that. General Pemberton soon ordered his army back into the defenses of Vicksburg. The Missourians were initially ordered to form a strategic reserve along Stout Bayou just south of the city. But in heavy entrenchments, redoubts, and redans along the high ground northeast and south of the city, the Army and the 6th Missouri took up positions in those defense works, the 6th Missouri locating itself in a position known later as the Third Louisiana Redan. It was after the Army withdrew into the defenses of Vicksburg that Josephine and Lula were actually reunited with Eugene Irwin. One can only imagine the scene of their meeting. Josephine and Lula, it seems, stayed with Colonel Irwin from that time forward. Soldiers of the 6th Missouri even recalled seeing Josephine walking the defense works to observe the enemy positions. They liked her very much. When the 6th Missouri entered the trenches at Vicksburg, it was carrying a new battle flag, not the one shown on the picture there. This one blue with a white Latin cross in the first quadrant, along with a red border. The flag was as odd as the old Van Doren flag that you see in the picture. All the Missouri regiments issued these new standards. Colonel Irwin, in possession of the old flag that you see there, which had been used at Corinth, gave it to Josephine with the admonition that she guard it and someday inscribe the story of the heroic attack of the 6th Missouri at the Battle of Corinth on that flag. She told him she would do so. Grant, directing his Army of the Tennessee up to the Confederate works, quickly grew impatient. On May 19, General William T. Sherman's 15th Army Corps assaulted the Confederate fortifications at Stockade Redan, north of the city, but failed. On May 22nd, Grant tried again, assaulting a front north and east of Vicksburg from Stockade Redan all the way to Fort Garrett, using General James B. McPherson's 17th Army Corps with limited success. A renewal of the attack the next day by General Edward O.C. Ord's 13th Army Corps, Ord replaced General McLearned, failed as well. Grant finally determined to lay siege to the city. He completely sealed off the town, enveloping all of its approaches from the northeast and south for 47 days. The army of John Pemberton and the people of Vicksburg would be denied all contact with the world. No food, provisions, munitions would find their way into the beleaguered city. After nearly 30 days of siege, Grant attempted an assault once again. This time he determined to launch an attack after detonating a mine beneath the Third Louisiana Redan. Using General McPherson's 17th Corps, the attack would be preceded by the construction of an elaborate trench or sap from the Federal lines to a point just below the Redan where a mine would be opened. The trenches would be constructed on either side of the main sap, paralleling the Confederate positions from which a steady fire could be delivered. To the 1st Brigade under the command of Brigadier General Mortimer Leggett, General John A. Logan's 3rd Division of McPherson's Corps went the assignment to mine and seize the Redan. Under the careful direction of Captain Andrew Hickenlooper, whose monument you will see there, of General McPherson's staff, Leggett's men, protected by advanced sharpshooters, ran this sap directly up to the Confederate works and opened trenches parallel to the enemy works along the Redan. At the mouth of the main perpendicular sap, prepared by Leggett's troops, a mine was opened. There, heavy charges of gunpowder were placed and ready for detonation. The Confederates were not unaware of this mining effort. General Lewis Hebert and his brigade could plainly see the trenching and mining efforts of the enemy in front of them. In response, Hebert had his men lay down ferocious volleys of gunfire at the miners and their covering sharpshooters. He also had his men throw grenades, some of them from lighted artillery shells, at the approaching enemy. The 3rd Louisiana Infantry was withdrawn from the front trenches of the Redan and ordered to strengthen the defense work to the rear so as to be out of harm's way once the charge exploded. As well, Hebert ordered a countermine prepared. On June 25th, at 3:30 p.m., Leggett ordered his 5 regiments to be ready to move. Lines were dressed. Behind him, General John D. Stevenson's 3rd Brigade was ready to assist Leggett's 1st Brigade. In Leggett's command, the 45th Illinois would lead the attack, supported by 100 men from the 23rd Indiana. At 4:30 p.m., the charge in the mine beneath the Redan was detonated. With a deafening report, huge masses of earth were thrown high into the air. Those who remember the explosion likened it to an earthquake or a volcanic eruption. A bright glare of fire issued from the burning gunpowder through the dense smoke and dust, and an immense crater was created by the blast. Few in the 3rd Louisiana were injured by the explosion, as the unit had withdrawn to its defense works constructed behind the Redan. Not so lucky were 6 soldiers of the 43rd Mississippi, who were buried alive in the countermine. From the Federal lines, the blast brought forth wild and sustained cheers. No sooner had the dirt settled and the cheering stopped than through the heavy smoke charged the 45th Illinois behind Captain Hickenlooper's sappers and miners. In the face of a wall of gunfire of the 3rd Louisiana, sappers and miners cleared an opening into the crater itself. Charging up a narrow perpendicular sap, the men of the 45th Illinois surged up into the crater, only to be met by sheets of flame from the Louisiana muskets. The struggle became desperate and bloody. Lieutenant Colonel Melancton Smith, waving his sword, yelled for his Illinoisans to follow. His color sergeant was alongside. Smith fell mortally wounded. His color sergeant, after planting the colors on the edge of the slope of the parapet, withdrew into the crater, unable to withstand the heavy wind. The men of the 45th Illinois were broken up into relief teams in order to maintain a sustained fire. After 30 minutes of heavy firing, their muskets fouled. Hand grenades were freely used on both sides, the Illinoisans hurling them over the parapet, and the men of the Third Louisiana throwing ignited artillery shells into the masses of blue coats below. Captain Hickenlooper brought forward timbers which had been loopholed for the soldiers' protection. And as the men set the timbers in place, General Martin E. Greene inside the Redan called for a 3-inch rifle gun of the Appeal, Arkansas battery to open fire. In minutes, great canister and wood splinters flew into the faces of the Illinoisans. The artillery, coupled with the heavy use of grenades, quote, made sad havoc among my men, recalled General Leggett. Colonel Francis M. Cockrell saw the mine explosion in the heavy gunfire. His 6th Missouri, in his brigade, was serving in reserve. He ordered it forward on the double to the relief of the Third Louisiana. Colonel Irwin, though sick, had climbed out of his bed. Josephine and Lula were there with him. This would be their last farewell. After buttoning his coarse gray frock coat, which he was seen wearing in that photograph, as though he was to lead his men on parade, Irwin kissed Josephine and Lula goodbye, mounted his horse, and rode out in front of his little battalion just as he had done at Corinth and Fort Gibson. His men loved him. They would follow him anywhere. At the double quick, the 6th Missouri marched toward the heavy gunfire and rapidly came into the rear of their old friends in the hard-fighting 3rd Louisiana. As Willie Tunnard of the 3rd Louisiana recalled seeing the approach of the Missourians, quote, well, the Louisianans knew their old comrades. Shoulder to shoulder had they stood together on many hard-fought fields, unmoved, unconquerable. Irwin dismounted, hobbled to the head of his brave little battalion and urged them forward with his upraised sword. Henry Clay's favorite grandson, the one he and Lucretia had raised themselves, was entering the contest at Vicksburg at one of its most critical hours. The gunfire between the 3rd Louisiana and the 45th Illinois had reached a deafening roar. Smoke covered the landscape. Grenades and shells exploded all around. Peal upon peal of artillery fire added to the fury of the moment. The 6th Missouri, with his brave colonel in the lead, rushed headlong into the melee in a counter thrust. Colonel Irwin then rashly mounted the parapet of the Redan and turned to his men shouting, come on, my brave boys, don't let the 3rd Regiment get ahead of you. In an instant, he was hurled to the ground as 2 musket shots pierced his chest. Colonel Irwin, beloved of Josephine and favorite of Henry Clay himself, was dead instantly. The 45th Illinois, overheated and fouled and its ranks terribly thin, had to be replaced. General Leggett sent the 20th Illinois into the crater. Hand grenades continued to be used on both sides. Private William Lazarus of Company I, 1st United States Infantry, after throwing 20 grenades into the ranks of the 3rd Louisiana, the 6th Missouri fell mortally wounded from a gunshot. The 20th Illinois was torn to shreds below the parapet by the heavy gunfire. General Leggett withdrew it and replaced it with the 31st Illinois, John Logan's old one. Then from the 3rd Brigade, Leggett sent the 56th Illinois, followed by the 23rd Indiana of his own brigade. All of the attacks were repulsed as the men crawled up the narrow perpendicular sap and entered the crater, which by then was heaped with dead and wounded. At dark, General Cockrell sent forward the 5th Missouri to take up the position alongside the remnants of the old 6th, relieving 3 companies of the 3rd Louisiana. From 11 p.m. until dawn, June 26th, the crater was held by the 17th Iowa and the 3rd Illinois. At dawn, the badly mauled 45th Illinois again was sent in to hold this dismal crater. Every attempt by General Leggett to place artillery in the crater was broken up by the Missourians, who rolled lighted shells into the midst of the bluecoats as they swarmed below the parapets of the Redan. That evening, a squad of Missourians brought the body of Colonel Irwin back to the bivouac site of the regiment. Josephine and Lula met the faithful comrades with their lifeless burden. The sadness must have been indescribable. It was made more so by the fact that Josephine had just become pregnant with their 4th child. The colonel's uniform was removed by torchlight. With the sound of guns in the distance, his body was shrouded, and then before Josephine and little Lula, he was buried by his men in the soft Mississippi earth. Savage fighting was renewed in the morning, but the Missourians held the Redan. The losses mounted. General Greene, one of Eugene's great admirers, was shot in the head and killed while viewing the enemy movement in the trench lines near the Redan. The attacking federal command had 250 men trying to take that Redan. Confederate casualties were much smaller, but among them, of course, was Irwin and General Greene. Only 9 days after Eugene Irwin's death, General Pemberton surrendered the city of Vicksburg to General Grant. It was all over. It must have seemed like a terrible wait to Josephine. Josephine and Lula were desperate. Like all of those souls in the beleaguered Vicksburg, they had lived on field peas and what meat from horses, mules, dogs, and even rats they could obtain. The ragtag veterans of General Pemberton's army were herded together, now prisoners of war. There was not one to assist Irwin's pregnant widow and little daughter. Both of them by then were starving, dirty, and ragged. To keep the old battle flag her husband had given her from being taken by federal soldiers, Josephine wrapped it around her waist beneath her dress. As well, she safely concealed the colonel's blood-stained uniform he had worn on the last moment of his life. But fate smiled on Josephine Irwin. While visiting with Confederate prisoners of war shortly after the surrender, Josephine found Lieutenant Edwin H. Hickman, who had commanded Company B of the 6th Missouri. Hickman had been friends with the Irwins in Fulton, Missouri, before the war and had lost an arm at the Battle of Corinth. He had been wounded again in the fighting at Vicksburg. Grasping the hand of her little daughter, Josephine, told Hickman of her plight. The kindly lieutenant determined to help her. A few days later, Hickman accidentally met Colonel Thomas Fletcher of the Federal 31st Missouri Infantry. Only 3 months before, Fletcher had been a prisoner of war guarded by Lieutenant Hickman. A friendship blossomed between the two men despite their differences. Colonel Fletcher asked if he could do something for Hickman. "Indeed you can," Hickman responded, and then spoke of the desperate plight of Josephine and Lula Irwin. "I can fix that," Fletcher said. Colonel Thomas Fletcher, later governor of Missouri, sought out Josephine and her daughter. The three of them went to General Grant's headquarters on July 18th. There, Josephine, still concealing the 6th Missouri's battle flag, wrapped around her waist and under her dress, was introduced to General Grant. She told him of her desperate situation, that her husband was Henry Clay's grandson and had been killed on June 25th. General Grant immediately sat down and scribbled out passes, one of which is photographed for you, for Josephine and her daughter to proceed home to Independence, Missouri in the company of Lieutenant Hickman. As Grant handed the passes to Josephine, he extended his hand to her. Overwhelmed with grief, Josephine refused the gesture. She thanked the general nevertheless, turned around, and with Lula at her side walked out of Grant's headquarters. First aboard U.S. Army transports, Josephine, Lula, and Lieutenant Hickman proceeded to St. Louis, and from there they traveled across the state of Missouri to Independence. And under Grant's orders, Hickman then returned to Vicksburg to await his own parole. With Josephine's father in Trinidad as an appointee of the Lincoln administration, and with nothing left in Missouri to fall back upon to support herself and her little children, Josephine wrote to John Morrison Clay, Henry Clay's youngest son, asking if she could come to Lexington, Kentucky and live at Ashland or in some other home of the Clays. John Clay wrote back inviting her to come. But sadness struck again. On January 26, 1864, Josephine gave birth to a daughter who she named Eugenia for her husband. The child lived only a few days and doubted the horrid circumstances under which her mother had labored from April 1863 until the child's birth were too much to sustain its frail life. After regaining her strength, Josephine packed up her three daughters, ages 10, 7, and 4, and traveled by wagon all across the state of Missouri and 3/4 of the way across the state of Kentucky. Packed in her baggage was Colonel Irwin's photograph, his blood-stained uniform, and wrapped around her waist beneath her dress was the old battle flag of the 6th Missouri. Arriving in Lexington, she found James Brown Clay living in Henry Clay's old homestead east of town, and the bachelor John Morrison Clay living south of town on a 250-acre farm known as Ashland on Tate Street Pike, where Henry Clay's widow, Lucretia, had spent the final years of her life. Henry Clay had bred and raised Hereford cattle and thoroughbred horses during his lifetime, but he had been too busy with law and political affairs to concentrate his energies on the livestock business. Consequently, back in 1842, when John Clay had reached the age of 25, his father had turned over the day-to-day operations of the farm to him. John had taken a special interest in the business. He had built in a short time a fine thoroughbred breeding stable at Ashland. The Civil War, though, had slowed the progress of that business. John welcomed the widow of his nephew. He had known Eugene Irwin well before the lad went to New York and California. Having served as his father's secretary in Washington, John remembered Eugene's visits to the capital city. He recalled how much his father had loved Eugene. Likewise, John knew the Russells. He recalled the aid and assistance that Colonel William Russell had given Henry Clay in Whig politics. Frankly, John M. Clay, like Colonel Russell, was a staunch supporter of Abraham Lincoln. Thus, into the home of John Morrison Clay moved the widow Josephine Irwin and her three little daughters. For a time, Josephine worked as kind of a housekeeper for the old bachelor in order to earn her keep. Soon, however, a romance blossomed. On July 7, 1866, Josephine Russell Irwin, the widow of the grandson of Henry Clay, married John Morrison Clay, Henry Clay's youngest son. As Mrs. John Morrison Clay, Josephine took a special interest in the thoroughbred farm. Standing at the farm with the great thoroughbred Yorkshire, by the end of the war, new horses were added. The mare Magnolia was given to John Clay by an admiring horseman, and then former Confederate General Wade Hampton gave John the mare Margaret Wood. These were great thoroughbreds of the day. These two horses became the nucleus of a thoroughbred horse empire at Ashland. Soon horses produced at this farm were being sent to every race course in America and England and on the continent of Europe. Magnolia was so great a breeding mare that she became known as the queen of the stock race, foaling 13 winners of celebrated derbies and stakes races. Maggie B.B. of the Clay farm was the dame of Iroquois, which won the English Derby. Sly Boots of the Clay farm was the dam of Sachem, who placed third in the English Derby. And for the great bloodstock, John Morrison Clay came to be known in his day as the Joseph Hawley of America. John Clay died on August 10, 1887. And then came the remarkable thing. Josephine took over this operation of the great stud farm after John's death. No changes are complicated, she advertised to horsemen then. The business will be continued on the same method as much as possible and managed by myself. This is a woman in the late 19th century. Under Josephine's management, the farm became even more renowned. She managed the farm with 25 miles of plank and rail fences which contained 30 gates. You can imagine a farm that size. The farm had 26 with lovely rolling bluegrass fields. One of her yearlings would sell for then the astronomical price of $8,200, and each of her horses would sell for an average of $3,500 at sale. Among the great horses at Ashland were Derby winners Minnie Elkins, Guilford, the winner of 42 stakes races, Von Tramp, Appomattox, Barefoot, Bright Phoebus, Semper Fidelis, Super Rex, Super Lex, Super Ego, and Loki. Loki stood 7.5 hands high and was reputed to be the largest thoroughbred horse in America at the time. In addition, the Clay farm bred Parachute, the great dam of Azra, a winner of the Kentucky Derby, and the great dam of Ben Brush, a winner of the Kentucky Derby, and it also bred 2 Kentucky Derby winners, Daystar and Riley, under the tutelage of Josephine Clay. Josephine loved her horses. In fact, like many Kentuckians, her love of animals is almost as strong as her love for the soil. Even when John Clay's favorite dog, Doc, a St. Bernard, died, she had that dog buried next to his master in the Lexington Cemetery, and you can still see the little stone that reads Doc alongside of John Clay's tombstone. Josephine was often seen strolling or riding across her farm wearing a broad-brimmed straw hat and toting a Colt revolver at her side. She would call to every horse, and each horse would respond to her voice. She would speak to them as though they were her children. Besides running the clay stud farm, Josephine, a literate woman, became a noted poetress and novelist. She became interested in women's suffrage and was asked to address the International Conference of Women in Toronto, Canada. Although she would not appear in person, she did forward an address entitled Women in the Professions, opining from her experience as a horse breeder that women could succeed in all the professions. For her day, she was a woman considerably ahead of her time. A patriot to the end, Josephine attended every reunion of Colonel Irwin's 6th Missouri Infantry, and each time she brought back that old battle flag. As Colonel Irwin had asked her to do, Josephine sewed onto the flag a hand-painted legend describing the 6th Missouri's famed assault at Corinth so all the veterans could remember. Before the turn of the century, she visited Vicksburg. There she found the grave of her beloved Colonel Irwin. She had his remains exhumed and brought back to Lexington, the place of his birth. There, Colonel Irwin is buried near the grave of his mother and just below the towering monument of his illustrious grandfather. On March 29, 1920, Josephine died. Buried alongside John Clay and only a few steps from the grave of Colonel Irwin, she left behind a remarkable legacy of devotion, courage, and perseverance. Before she died, she remarked to her family that her only regret in life was that she did not accept General Grant's hand when he had extended it to her at Vicksburg in that terrible July of 1863. Of Colonel Irwin, most people know little today, but he was one of Kentucky's genuine Civil War heroes. Captain James E. Payne of the 6th Missouri best summed up the heroic war effort of Irwin in his command when he wrote this: "Go look upon that line of dead where there lay like a harvest in a windrow, there where the blood is trickling down the hill slopes and eddying in smoking pools, and there you will find many, many more of the noble youths and sturdy manhood Irwin had loved so well." Brave and devoted, beloved Colonel Irwin, like his wife Josephine, boldly faced all the trials and tragedies presented to them by life. He died like the ancient Greeks believed a man should die, heroic in the prime of life. Though largely unknown and forgotten until recently, Colonel Irwin and Josephine's lives, because of their steadfastness and devotion, simply could not remain obscure forever. Such lives defy obscurity. They are too heroic, too great in simple character. Such is the legacy of the Colonel and his legend. Thank you all very much.
Can we take a few questions if you'd like to ask? Kind of hard to postscript that, isn't it?
When you go out there, and I've got to move real quickly here, but when you go out to the park, your illustrious guide will show you from the federal position, from Logan's position, the approaches to the Redan. And as you go through what's left of those saps, those trenches leading into the Redan, you can see up to your right a memorial with the bronze likeness of Colonel Irwin up there just above you, and that marks the spot where Colonel Irwin fell. It's the most beautiful, beautiful place. Yes.
You know what 31st Mississippi was positioned in that battle?
I could not tell you. I know Ed could probably give you it was, you want to step in here?
On what day?
And at what time?
What hour? Thank you all. Have a good day.